Welcome to the Integral Stage. In this Integral Stage Mindwalk, Layman, Pascal, and I take on the vexing topic of time, its nature, the multiple forms and stages of our understanding and experience of it, and the importance of awareness or mindfulness of time for our daily lives. How do our temporal paradigms influence the structure of ourselves and worlds? How can greater awareness of time help to awaken and empower us or increase our intimacy with being? These are some of the questions we hope to explore. Layman Pascal was initially inspired to bring this topic to the Integral Stage after he experienced some insights into time during a recent shamanic journey. Synchronistically, Integral Life just published a dialogue between Corey DeVos and Dr. Keith Witt on time, development, consciousness, and the healing of trauma. And personally, I've long been fascinated by the topic of time, from early readings in cosmology, physics, and philosophy, but especially from years of practice of the time-space knowledge vision of Tartong Tulku. We'll discuss a number of time mindfulness practices during our talk, and we will also include a meditation at the end for you to try out. So, let's begin.
Time! What is it and why should we care? Or more like, what is it and why should we care and how did we get there? Like in my mind, that's the ontology. What is time? Physics, philosophy. What's thinkable about time? What does it really consist of? Fascinating to me, but ultimately the least significant part, because it doesn't really help anybody do anything. What good is it? I think it's obvious that if we related to time differently, we would have different outcomes in our lives and collectively in our civilization, and what are practices that help us do that. And then also biographical, which is, why do we care? What experiences have we had? What things have we seen? How has our sense of time changed? And along the line of how our sense of time has changed, that's a good way to get into time might be different for people at different stages of complexity. And then this will sound like it's actually integral.
Yeah, without the stages, it's not integral, right? You have to get into the levels. That sounds great. And yeah, I'm hoping in this dialogue we can look at time both in some conventional and familiar ways as a kind of an entry way, but also maybe speak about it in some non-conventional ways, ways that maybe people don't often relate to it. I think those are great points, that how we experience time, how we conceptualize time, how we embody it, those actually have a pretty profound impact on our lives. And so I think it's really interesting to explore that and to touch on whatever experiences and exercises or explorations we've gotten into that have been able to shift things for us. And yeah, so I'd like to let you take the lead on it, and then I'll jump in with some of my own interests also.
Well, it's hard to know which of those things to start with. I think most people jump in on the ontology part, which is maybe a safe way to start. Let me ask you this. Do you think eternity exists?
No.
Why not? And if eternity doesn't exist, what's the significance and what's the status of people's experience of eternity?
Yeah. Actually, I would say, I believe in a kind of eternality, a kind of eternity. But you threw me a curveball with a pretty big, massive ontological question there. That's a hard one to start on.
I should have started with the biographical. Sorry.
Seriously, I think there is something to explore there in terms of at least the experience of, there's classical philosophical distinctions, for instance, between the Nunc-stans and the Nunc-fluens, the standing or abiding time and the flowing time. And often our ordinary worldly experience relates to the flowing time, the experience of being propelled along in moments of becoming and change. And then occasionally our mystics and poets and others describe some experience of being suspended in a space where it seems time doesn't move, but there's this incredible overflowing fullness of presence that seems to eclipse the sense of the meaningfulness of the unfolding of moments. And so I think both of those things are experiential reality. They exist in our realm of possibilities for lived experiences of time, without maybe me taking the step out there to make an absolute metaphysical claim about the state of reality itself. But I could say definitely, and actually philosophically, to me, it makes more sense that things have always been here rather than suddenly things started at some obscure point. That never has really made sense to me. So philosophically, I could really get behind a kind of infinitism or eternality in the sense of there always being. But we could maybe do that dance between metaphysics and post-metaphysics, where we focus more on at least what can show up for us in the experiential field.
Yeah, it seems like eternity has two different meanings. And one's actually a little bit more spatial. And one, I think, is a lot of people get an unnecessarily metaphysical read on time because they conceive it in spatial terms. Mm-hmm. Like when we talk about forwards and backwards, things like that, right?
Right.
I'm a skeptic about the beginning of time, and I'm a skeptic about an eternity, or what they call in physics block time, all the past and the future existing simultaneously next to the becoming, or both of those seem sketchy to me. But when I was a kid, I thought about time a lot. I had some strong intuitions about eternity. Later, I had some experiences that I conceived at the time as being outside of time in a hyperspace. But later, philosophically, I began to deny myself that interpretive possibility, because it seemed to me a lot of it, reading Henry Bergson, really opened my eyes to the idea of things that I couldn't actually think, that I just thought I could think. And it seemed to me like an additional space that could be outside of everything. That's not something I can actually think of. So I shouldn't be using it in my interpretive model.
Right.
So that's where I'm at. I'm at an eternity as a continuum, because I can't think of a point before which there wasn't time. And for like my definition of time, my loose definition would be the set of all possible changes. And so a beginning would be a change, and it would presuppose time.
Right.
So I can't think of beginning, but I also can't think an outside of time. And almost every instance of people in fiction or mysticism describing their experience, and I did this too, describing it as if it were outside of time, seems to be either imagining time as if it were space, or just imagining an additional time, right? Like if you, in fiction, there's a lot of creatures who are like the hyperspatial illuminated beings who can pop in and out of different time zones as if they were locations in space. But for them, that actually takes some time. There's a continuity, there's a past and a future for them in doing that. So we're not actually thinking in those cases of the absence of time. We're thinking of the suspension of one set of changes, but there's also another set of changes going on. And as long as there's any possible changes, then there's time, as far as I'm concerned. That's philosopher's time, not clock time, Einstein time. There's a very pragmatic way to look at it too, which is just things oscillate.
Right. Yeah, I think some of the things that we talk about and maybe, say we believe in or postulate are really just things that, as, Wittgenstein pointed out, things that our language can make possible. We can make constructions with our language, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually thinkable, right? It's just possible as a linguistic construction because we can put these elements together.
And I think in that Wittgenstein sense, when we get the idea that we might be able to think something because we can say it, then we supplement that feeling with some ideas that are actually from a different domain. Like today in the bath, I was trying to think whether I actually could think about time moving in two directions, right? Because I could think, okay, if it's one thing like this, then I'm sure I could read it going this way or read it going this way. The same changes could look like they're going in either direction. But then I thought, in order to imagine that, I'm imagining there's a direction. I'm imagining it like it's space. I'm imagining it like it's an object in space that I could look at either way, which it isn't.
Exactly. It's really interesting how we very often spatialize time. Not all languages or cultures do that, but majority of Western ones do for sure. And yeah, I think that's a good distinction to make between the philosophical time and then the clock time. And we might also talk about lived time or experiential time as different domains or different areas that we can explore. I think we really, have this. I fully agree with your suggestion that when we think we're talking about being outside of time, usually we're just postulating actually some other way of conceiving of the arrangement of time, or the way to relate temporally, or the way to initiate changes or transformations, or the way to abide. But they're still all in some way a kind of time. And so, we'll get into this a little bit later, I think, when we talk about stages of development and how they look at time over time. But I prefer, actually, I think a little bit the time-space knowledge, the TSK framing over Gebser's in his discussion of the timeless, and before you get to the time, and then the atemporal, or the spaceless, and then the space, and then, TSK just starts with time and space, but imagines that they have different forms of intensity and indensity of expression, rather than postulating really something that's not thinkable about timelessness, in a sense, unless you're only framing it as in a bracketed way as the sense of the loss of the familiar flow of time, or something like that.
Yeah, and then that's one of the problems in not only casual conversation, but a lot of physics and philosophical conversation, is that people really they're not saying timeless, they're saying different kind of time, those sorts of things, different quality, different tempo, something like that. I remember one of the really interesting experiences I had in my early 20s was an evening where it seemed like the flow of time slowed down or became more obvious, like I was looking at it through a microscope, and as if I could see the moment spaced out. And then in seeing that, I fell through, and for a while it was as if I was up a hill, and that I could survey the past and the future in both directions, and it was as if they both knew about each other, and I could also look out in all the other directions as well. And I conceived that as being outside of time, and yet I went in and saw things there and came out of it. So it was all technically within objective time somehow, even though my subjective experience was that I was somehow outside or above time. And one of the ways I've been thinking about it since then is by this surfing analogy, which is if the surfboard's on a wave, they're both moving, but the surfer isn't moving relative to the wave. For him, it looks still. And if you were moving with time, whatever that might mean, then while that was happening, time might seem to stop for you in a variety of ways. And you're actually having a deeper experience of time. You're actually going with it better. And it feels to you as if you're outside of time because you don't detect its motion relative to yourself.
Exactly. I sometimes use the metaphor, or think about the metaphor of when you get an engine running just right, yeah, and everything is in sync and there's no shakes and shimmies. It just enters this space of pure coherence where it goes silent, and there's like an alignment of things together where you it's only in the difference that you have experiences. So when there's that sufficient alignment and you're not noticing any variation or change, it's actually an intensity of participation, but it feels like like a non-happening. Yeah. Right. I could think also, of moments when I was younger. Probably I was in my early 20s, also early 20s. I remember once watching an intensely emotional movie. It was maybe not a really deep, profound movie, but one that was touching and emotional. And I had gone and watched it by myself, and then left the theater and was going to walk home at night back to my dormitory at college. And somehow, just the moment I stepped out of the theater, I was struck by the immensity of the sky and the stars and the subtlety of the movement of the trees and the wind. And everything began to, I don't know how to say it except scintillate and percolate. And it felt like every single appearing was rapidly and as a flame disappearing at the same time. There were just this flow of unceasing disappearances, in a sense. You could say it's an intense experience of kind of impermanence from a Buddhist point of view. But I really felt my mortality, my passing in that, but also it was also a sense of a strange participation in the creative becoming of time, where I was not then something outside of time, in a sense, watching it do stuff in a way. It was much more of a participatory immersion in this creative manifesting of a universe. And there was both a coming alive and a dying that happened in a very intense and kind of even emotional way for me as I walked home in the middle of that.
That's beautiful. And it makes me think of something that's beautiful about the English language. And I don't know, maybe other languages have something like this, but we say good timing, right? Which has the sense of a good time, but also of time itself, and also of something like higher consciousness or an upgrade in our participation with the universe, right? You could easily argue that what people mean by enlightenment is some form of good timing. Mm-hmm. I actually often think about, there's one of the Harry Potter movies, and they give the girl a necklace where she can travel back in time so she can do multiple courses, but they end up having to go back in time and thwart some evildoers. Mm-hmm. And the magus who runs the place, Dumbledore, I guess, in the past, he's unaware of this. He has not yet given her the device. But when they're trying to perpetrate their scheme, everything he does helps them out. He even distracts people by pointing things out. He doesn't know they're there, but because of the degree of his being, his timing is such that it works almost without a plan. His timing exceeds his ability to strategically participate in the universe, and it becomes an omnidirectional efficiency. Beautiful.
I love that insight. And it actually brings up something that I wanted to talk about in our talk together. One, first, I just wanted to, that good timing. The Greeks distinguished between chronos and kairos as two kinds of time. Chronos being, the flowing and sequential kind of time, and kairos being something like auspicious timing or the right time. And they're kind of like these gaps where you look for the exact creative intervention point. You're waiting for that kairos, but to me there's a kairotic way of being where it's a kind of attunement to things that is like your expression of what Dumbledore was in his being. He was more kairotic at that time in terms of his participation in things was allowing the universe to go better, in a sense. Right? So that brings me in a way to what I wanted to ask you about, and what I was kind of meaning by non-conventional ways of talking about time. And that is, have you ever noticed in people the way that they bear time? How they embody time, how they manifest and express time, how it shows up in their presence and presencing, in the way that they relate. Have you noticed differences in the ways that people embody and express time?
Well, I can think of some obvious things that I've repeatedly observed that I think probably most people have, right? The harried person who for some reason always underestimates the amount of time they have to achieve a task. And whether they do that on purpose to get the high of rushing at the end, or whether they're just miscalculating. That's interesting. Some people it might vary, and other people might predictably miscalculate. There's also other people who don't seem to be able to get anything underway, right? The gunas and things like that. The sattvic type of person, or the pitta, all these different analytic modalities out of the East may refer to different tempos of being. One person is more slothful, and one person races too much, like the fire races too much. Another person seems very measured. There's definitely something about people who have the ability to perform well, high performance flow states, or even relaxed confidence. People seem to have a certain tempo that reminds you of Tai Chi. Mm-hmm. One of the things that always interested me is anybody could fake doing Tai Chi, right? Now, if you ask them to fake it, they start moving at a particular pace. It's a certain way of sequencing their movements in accordance with time, and we can all just guess what it is. I think it's one at which there's a maximum feedback into our central nervous system from the activity as we do it. And obviously, anybody who's watched musicians can see them have different relationships to time. Mm. So I think those are things that are very general experiences, as well as the sense that some people feel and embody long durations in themselves. A classical kind of a person, or a person who has goals. What's Elon Musk up to? His working time frame seems to be centuries or something like that.
Right.
What did you have something in mind when you asked that?
Yeah, I was thinking just about sometimes different experiences I've had of being with people where my own experience of time shifts just being with them. Yeah, have you had anything like that?
Yes, and sometimes, it's very much, it shades into the experience of spiritual transmission or darshan and things like that, where there's a very personal side. There's some people just in your life. Often when a romance starts, you might get odd time effects with somebody and not know how long you've been with them. At the same time, there's certain individuals or places that seem to exert this effect on us by whatever means. People you can sit with where after you've been there 5 or 10 minutes, you're not sure how long you've been there, and you feel like maybe this moment stands in eternity somehow. Mm-hmm. And they draw you into that very readily. And I would assume that's an effect of the rate of the wiggles in their electromagnetic field, but there could be other effects going on there.
Right, yeah. And depends on, how creatively and metaphorically you want to use the word time.
Yeah.
We can think about, timing as, that's a TSK way of talking about things, timing in that situations and people time themselves out or are engaged in a mode of timing that you can feel, that you can qualitatively feel the differences of that, where for some people, being in their presence, it feels like there's more obstruction. There's not a lot of free flow of energy or movement, and you feel that there's a stalling, a kind of stalling of energy and possibility of movement of insight or whatever. And others, you feel that you could just fall into this, vast depth, of their presence.
And the kind of person who is bursting, exploding, overloaded, right?
Right.
The kind of person who needs a timeout.
Exactly. Yeah, and also just thinking about how time shows up, going back to the word kairos and timeliness. A lot of people that I talk to in classrooms and other places about time, a lot of them actually people who've just started on a spiritual journey oftentimes, they feel that they're in this special graced flow in which things just present themselves and people show up and events happen and opportunities open, and they just feel that they're immersed in something that's really right about the synchronization of events that really, you could say, intensifies their experience and their growth process. And so one way to look at that is that word kairos, that sense of being timely in a way that's coherent with time's movement in a way.
Yeah, I wonder how much of that has to do with a plastic or assimilative quality in the person's mind. There's like kairos as a meta-opportunistic stance, where the person is able to take over many occurrences that are showing up and pattern them together so that they feel this is all one movement of synchronicity, because everything is already synchronized. I always feel, do you believe in synchronicity? I'm like, well, my ass is on the chair and I'm not falling through it right now. Like, that's pretty amazing. They're both working and it's serving me great. But that's not what they mean. What they mean is all of the normal synchronicities are standing out for some reason. So the being has grasped them and woven them together somehow in a way that both feels intensely meaningful, but gives them a kind of surge, gives them a wave to ride on, so that as they go forward into the next moment, they seem to be able to navigate it with a different kind of relationship to time, a higher level, right? Meta-opportunistic flow.
That's a good turn of phrase. I like that. And it's a good post-metaphysical way to put it. It's not postulating that the whole universe is now suddenly cooperating with you, except that it is the whole universe cooperating with you.
Yeah,
I mean.
I'm very Nietzschean on that, right? Which is, it's not the case that the universe was set up for you, but if you were healthy, that's how you would experience it.
Right.
He's an interesting character. Obviously, I like a lot of his thinking, but one of his definitions of a philosopher is an untimely human being, right? Someone who feels long durations of time and feels themselves outside of the contemporary evaluations, such that they can provide a useful critique of today's values. But in order to do that, they have to experience their own being as either decentered into another epoch, or something that's very long and spans many epochs and is not in the moment of the world that everyone else is in.
Yeah, I like that juxtaposition of the untimely with the timely that we've just been talking about. And that untimely being somehow in that individual an envelope is created or an opening is created that allows for an influx of insights or whatever from a broader scope than most people are entertaining at that time. Yeah, I guess that makes me think also about the prophets. A prophet is a kind of person like that, where if we think about the prophet not necessarily as a fortune teller, but as somebody who, in some sense, stands at the edges of conventional time and is able to pronounce on, the events of that time in a way that appears oracular because they have a bigger, maybe a bigger scope of pattern recognition in their expression.
Well, I think prophet is a concept that would have different significance at different sociocognitive stages.
Right.
That a lot of the Old Testament prophets in any tradition occupy this millennial time where there was a creation and a single ruler, a single epoch, a single book, and then there will be an apocalypse, and it will last a few thousand years, and then the next cycle will begin. And things go well or not based on how well people in the cycle obey the official rules for living in that cycle that are in the one book. So those prophets are usually saying, we've got to get back on track with the established official rules, or else we will hasten the end of this multi-millennial cycle or not, right? But a more modern or orange level, or whatever we want to say, oracular figure might be providing individuals with some useful pragmatic wisdom for their rationality to wrestle with, to help improve their overall timing in the span of the progressive deep time that those people are aware of. So maybe now that we're on this, we should start looking at what stages might be as a loose way of categorizing time. Because in my mind, I would go, like I would start with something like what we imagine animal time is like, and then a primitive time, and then the sort of apocalyptic kingdom millennium time, and then deep time that science brings forth, and then all the pluralistic explosions of time that are possible now, relativism, fractal time, time across many worlds, that kind of stuff, and then some kind of trans-pluralistic diaphanous time, whatever that means. So I'd probably use like a simple breakdown like that, like 4 or 5 stage-like chunks.
Yeah, that works for me too. And obviously, Gebser does something like that. I think Torbert, someone who talks about, developmental studies applied to business and that sort of thing, actually has a discussion of time and modes of time that's pretty interesting and aligns with that a little bit, which I can talk about. TSK just breaks it down into 3. Actually, it entertains more, but its basic typology is just 3. Yeah, I think, Gebser talks about there being, the pretemporal and the pre-spatial, which we imagine is, possibly what animals or very primitive beings might experience. I think some animals are more sophisticated and they might not be stuck there. And then we have a progression through time that Gebser traces of actually first a kind of spacelessness and timelessness, and then there's a kind of a natural time, but space actually hasn't really emerged yet until basically perspectivity emerges. And then we start to get the located subject in a spatialized realm, and space becomes objectified at that point, and it becomes a thing. And then we also have abstract time coming on board there, and then it moves forward ultimately towards the diaphaneity of time that you were just pointing to. I like a distinction in, you could say there's like a pre-reflective time, a reflective time, and a post-reflective time. Pre-reflective time, have you ever heard of the tribe, the Piraha in South America? They're a really unusual tribe in that their language seems to break all of the rules in terms of what we've discovered about languages so far. They don't have recursion, and they don't count beyond 2 or 3, and actually they can't even be taught to count beyond 2 or 3, whereas other tribes that haven't had that many number systems, like in Papua New Guinea, they've been able to be taught. And the Piraha are not stupid, but they're really committed to kind of a sense of immediacy that doesn't entertain or even find much value in looking towards past or future. So there's you could say either a very simple nowness, but there's a pre-reflective kind of immersion. And for them, they're not even interested. The whole millennial epic with the whole prophet tradition, that was not a good sell with them, in terms of the missionaries. They had no grasp or interest of that kind of time frame.
So hypothetically, there might be different ways for people to evolve. Like they might upgrade to another stage, so to speak, and it might not look like the upgrade that we're familiar with historically. And there might be more advanced forms of seemingly pre-reflective immersion and that kind of stuff. So maybe I'll start us on each of these and we can talk a little bit about each one and see where we want to go with that.
Okay.
When I think about animals, and it's always human privilege to think about animals, we have a sense, we joke about the idea that they have a very short window, right? Like a dog only knows about a minute. You go out the door, he thinks you're gone for good, he howls, you come back in a minute later, it's like you're back from the dead. It's his whole existence. So there's that, all right? And there's probably some truth to that they have situational memory for the most part. But also they undergo trauma, they learn things, And these are ways that information is encoded in them that stays with them over years. So it's not quite correct to say they only have this little window, but they might only have that little window in the place that we think of cognition as being. At any rate, they don't seem to reflect on time or organize time into larger chains, with the exception of a few of what we call the higher animals. You know, an elephant never forgets, that kind of stuff. We don't know quite where those edges are and in what species they get there. But there does seem to be this not yet narrative memory that is the clock for the animals. And then the primitive humans also don't have external clocks, but they have narrative memory as a clock. They have a sense of a continuity of the self that the animal might not have. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. I think about dogs who know when to go to the door and wait before the people come home. And it's not that they're hearing the car coming, but they know the time of day. Mm-hmm. So I think the phrase that you used about situational awareness, that there probably is an internal clock that they recognize. We actually know that, our own internal clock is a correlation of light sensitivity and genetics. So probably something like that is functioning in the dog as well, that they correlate a certain shade of light, and situational things as cues for this happens at that point. I don't think dogs are probably sitting there thinking and waiting and counting the hours. I don't think they have that kind of window. But there is an echo of the past and maybe an unconscious presence of some expanded temporal awareness that's operative in them. But it's not taking place of that.
For me, sorry, not to cut you off there, but there are many possibilities for temporal correlation, right? Like every one of the cells and the heart and all that stuff in the dog, those are oscillators, right? And they can pick up cues and they can oscillate and fall into synchrony with many other processes and a range phenomenon in the dog. But what we don't know is where that becomes the dog's sense of time.
Exactly. Yeah, that's where I was going to go just with that last point, is that all of that may not really enter into the window of their awareness or processing, but it's happening at the level of behavior.
So then the next one up would be something like primitive human time or childhood time and things like that. We often reach for the dream time metaphor, which is to say an awareness that a lot of people seem to have, that they were one step away from being back in a pre-narrative temporal universe, right? That they were going to be back with the animals and the dead if they just stepped off the path 1 inch. The dream time was right there all around them. But they did have something in them that allowed them to contrast against that realm of time. And something like a more narrative self. I mean, I remember my first memories, so to speak. I remember a flashbulb going on. I remember seeing my dad working on a fence in the driveway. And then it was like I didn't remember anything else for another 6 months. And then another flash, and then some more flashes. And then all of a sudden, a continuous biography. Mm-hmm. Now, I was having experiences before that. And I was operating with some degree of time intelligence. But I didn't have a sense that I was the continuous entity undergoing that. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, I couldn't use a clock, couldn't use a calendar. Obvious things to an adult had to be pointed out to me. They tell me what day it is. You remember we're going into the other room now? Right, of course, the other room. It may have been a camping mind too. I think when people go out camping and they don't take clocks, they're not on a schedule, their sense of how they have to make metrics of experience temporally changes. You stop thinking, how long is a second? How long is a day? How long is an hour? And you start thinking, how long does it feel we should be at the beach? Mm-hmm. How long should I continue to sit by the fire? That kind of stuff. How long should I check to see if there's a wolf near the campsite or not? So we have these very fluid experiential ways of breaking time into chunks that go along with this narrative primitive self, but aren't yet closely metricized to some kind of known objective official measure like a clock or a calendar.
My son also has several times talked to me about his recollection of when he started, when he began as an experiencing subject. And basically he says, that's when my memories turned on. And he knew before that he was suspended in some kind of blind participation, in a sense, in things. But after that, he fully recalls that it's like a light went on. He experienced himself as a subject, was able to connect that mom and dad are upstairs, and started, moving himself up the stairs. And he said from that point forward, he had a narrative self. So he clearly recalls that emerging, which I think is remarkable that he started recalling that about age 14 or so. But yeah, so that I definitely relate to that and witnessed that unfolding in my son in terms of his own recognition of the construction of his self. And I think it's tied, obviously, speaking of narrative self, to language, right? So I think, typically this won't be happening for an individual prior to, 3 to 5 years, when we start moving into being a verbal self. And that's also classically, developmentally, when we start to constellate whole self in relationship to objects, and we attain some stability there.
So then the next one up in my mind is what I called Millennial Civilization, or people who have a sense of a couple thousand years viscerally feels pretty accurate. They're still around. The Earth is 6,000 years old, feels true to them. This nonsense about 14 billion, that's just horseshit somebody's saying. It doesn't feel real. But where do they get that? I think a lot of it is calendars, right? From very primitive calendars to much more elaborate calendar culture. The people who rose to be the meta-tribal kingdom people, the urban agrarian people, they had a calendar-based society, right? They got together on an official calendar that they could all use to track the when the herds were coming, when we're going to put the crops in. So there's a domestication angle. When is the Nile going to flood? That kind of stuff. We get that down, and we're all prepped. We know our roles for next time. So the role-playing people have a sense of the calendar, but then also of the great calendar, the great year in which that all occurs, and then cycles of these great years. Mm-hmm. I want to say the West. In the Middle East, the monotheisms that came out of there tended to think of like one multi-millennium chunk. Starts with a creation, has an organizing author, ends in an apocalypse when people have forgotten the way. Now, most of the other cultures, my impression is, think very much of many of these cycles, or an indefinite number of these cycles, which creation, apocalypse, Ramana opens his eye, closes his eye, opens his eye, that kind of thing. So there is a sense in which in Europe we're culturally descended from some people who had a bit of a truncated view, in my view. They were just looking at this one chunk. But if you nibble around the edges, there was somebody or something there to create the beginning of the cycle. And then there is a sense that afterwards, maybe a new heaven and earth will be put together. So it's a sense that there are many of these units, but these units are particular. They have this creation apocalypse form. They're run by a people in a caste system with roles, and they consist of, several thousand, not several billion or 5 or 6. It's a very specific kind of time frame that works for them, the calendar cults. It's probably still our basic human superstition, right? Even very unsuperstitious people are responsive to astrology, both Chinese and Western. They're responsive to birthdays. They're emotionally responsive to the holy days all around the calendar. Even if we feel like we're done with it, you still sit around. If you're not doing anything at Christmas, you feel like, am I left out? Am I missing something? Your stress rate goes up because you're keyed in to this thousands and thousands of years of practice of teaching ourselves this calendar metric as our basic time organizing feature.
And we find examples in some cultures, I think, where they expand on that. But yeah, it's, you know, maybe a little bit later stages before we really begin to move into the modern. And I don't know if what step you're going to take here, but I'm thinking about like the old Buddhist or Hindu examples of trying to help us to imagine a kalpa, you know, some vast expanse of time for people. Like however long, if a bird, you know, a Garuda flies by and rubs its wing on the top of Mount Everest once every 100 years, you know, the time it would take for the wing to, you know, wear the mountain down is the length of this kalpa. So they began to play with, you know, images and metaphors to expand and hold in bigger and bigger times. But nevertheless, it retained this pattern of repeating cycles. And it was still, you could say, archetypally organized, and even in a more basic way, kind of fractally organized. Fractal play of like the eternal archetypes within this.
Wheels within wheels.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, there's an upgrade, right? There's people who got involved in upgrading the calendar at various times and places, right? We have a historical modernity got locked in moment in Europe a few hundred years ago, but those weren't the first modern intellects, right? We go back to Athens. I'm sure we go back to a lot of the people who were involved in the shift that was the axial age.
Right.
Right. A lot of them did a lot more impressive thinking, but they had to use the terms that were in the culture around them.
Exactly.
So they're now thinking about technical infinities. They're playing with different ideas of different time scales. They're trying to lock in an idea of a calendar that exceeds the people's calendar. And a lot of people play with that for a long time until we get these methodological and technological revolutions in Europe that kind of lock that in. And at that point, there's a radical shift to the deep time. And suddenly we're talking cosmology, geology, and the biosphere. We're talking billions of years as the basic unit instead of thousands of years. And the interesting thing about this deep time is it's progressive. There's enough time for things to have changed radically, right? In these small wheels of several thousand years, one cycle will be very much like the next, right? There'll be a different chief god, there'll be a different king, there'll be a different book, but it'll go pretty much the same way with pretty much the same technological savvy. They imagined this rising and falling happening over and over again. They didn't conceive necessarily of, except maybe one or two of the crazy ones, airplanes, spaceships, cloning, right? This kind of, they didn't imagine radical change occurring over this deep time. But as we look back and we see there used to be dinosaurs here, or, you know, life didn't used to have gender or death, or, you know, this, the earth came to constellated itself out of a bunch of nebulous gas and ice and dust. These long spans allow things to have progressed into their current state, and they go along with the sense that we can keep progressing forward. So that modern consciousness is simultaneously a long, deep time into the past, and a sense that it's picking up the pace, that we can keep changing it going forward. And they index that to physical oscillators. They get really good at capturing physical oscillators. Start with maybe pendulums. You move on to gears. You move on to quartz crystals and atomic vibrations. You get this beautiful, extremely precise and nuanced sense of progressive deep time.
Yeah, I think that shift that's happened in modernity, we really haven't fully digested you could say, the potential for it to be sacred for us. The early pioneers in the calendar cultures that were beginning to experiment and play with, you know, mathematical and rational thought and imagine these infinities, and they were able to use that to inject a sense of infinity and awe and a sense of a deep participation, even though it had not yet progressed in that culture to a sense of evaluation necessarily of becoming that we're now coming to now. But I think that's a shift that's afoot right now, is that science and technology are allowing us to begin to be able to think this deep time way and to see this broader scope of change, which is, I think, calling our time to pull away from the privileging of being over becoming to now valuing becoming itself as, as a sacred manifestation of time, profoundly creative and dynamic, and actually maybe epically important for us in the sense, I think it's last name of Fisher. I can't remember his first name. He wrote a book called Radical Ecopsychology. But one of the things that he talks about is we're facing so many world-size crises right now that are habitual or culturally familiar ways of thinking about time and of time scales. We're not able to actually get a big enough view to really take a perspective on what's happening. And so it can feel overwhelming and crushing, and that this sense of deep time is going to be a tool that can enable us to begin to inhabit bigger scopes of temporal perception that might allow us to digest some of the epical changes that are happening right now and better respond.
I think that's right. And I also think that's one of the reasons you get the rise of science fiction and speculative fiction in the modern era as a way to try to aesthetically add those time frames to the current problems. Because we look back, and people that aren't comfortable with deep time in a visceral way, they seem to need a story where things were rushed, right? The creator showed up, boom, things got underway. They were pretty much like they were right now, and now it's now, right? How could it have evolved bit by bit? Sounds ridiculous to them. But when you viscerally get this notion of deep time, you go, there was tons of time. There was tons of time for this to get handled. And likewise, the problems we're facing in the imminent future seem really squished up in our view. And some of them are imminent, but our way of understanding them seems to lack the languid nature. I almost said spacious nature, but I don't want to use space as a metaphor for time. This languorous nature that gives us a feeling that we have the time to handle these things. Mm-hmm. And the other thing about that modern thing is just the proliferation of clocks, right? The moment everybody's house has a clock, everybody can inspect the concept of time as a piece of their daily experience. Mm-hmm. So we get turned on to becoming in a very straightforward fashion, just that we have clocks now. You have a calendar in your home. You don't have to go down to the stone circle in the center of the village. You don't have to check with the priests. It's all right there. But then this other thing happens, right? And I think Einstein is the symptomatic event point because he introduces this conversation about time being relative. And what he means is if you compare clocks under different conditions, you get different results. So he's got these modern time-keeping devices, but he's not looking at one of them to track time. He's looking at the comparison between them to track time. And that opens up this whole idea that it's a flexible procedure. And while he's saying that and everybody's walking around going, nobody understands what this guy's talking about, which seemed like it went on for decades, that conversation in the public, right away, people start talking about the quantum thing at the same time, where it is as if multiple time streams are needed to explain what the subatomic particles are doing. Right? Whether we credit an actual many worlds or not, something analogous to simultaneous time streams needs to be computed in order to figure out what any one of these particles is doing. That's huge. And then we could have fractal time, and then we get the cultural phenomenon of retro, where the idea is that you go forward, and the forward seems to contain more of the past, but on purpose. Maybe the past and the future are converging. There's this extreme ambiguity and multi-directional plurality and flexibility, and all of it's predicated upon a relational experience of clocks to each other. Green time.
Exactly, green time. Yeah, that shift towards the between. And I think I saw a week ago an article that just came out. The phenomenon of entanglement is, vexing and to a lot of people. And usually it's conceived in spatial terms, that if two electrons or photons emerge from the same source, then they're entangled, and you can statistically determine their correlation. If you interfere with one, you get, statistically you get, the opposite reaction in the other. And for the first time, I think it was about a week ago, a paper came out, said that they've been able to demonstrate entanglement among particles that had never had a relationship with each other, that were not emerging from the same source, but nevertheless, that were actually introduced later into the system. And they actually also displayed entanglement with the other particles being measured. So they went into this Einsteinian frame to begin to try to conceive of that maybe they're occupying different time cones in a sense, and where it looks like there's backwards causation in time, but it might not be that.
Yeah, it's I'm a skeptic about retrocausality, partly because I don't think there's a future from which those effects could be entering into the present.
Mm-hmm.
However, the idea that there are minds that reach for reverse causality as an explanation for how processes are occurring indicates a kind of green level of complexity in thinking about time, for sure. They're taking modern time and they're looping it, splicing it, twisting it, flipping it over, comparing it to itself, all that kind of, they're remixing deep time.
Exactly. Basically deconstructing time and then trying to reconstruct it,
I'm interested, like that idea of an experiential or cultural convergence of the past and the future interests me a lot. It's not just retro. It's sort of, we definitely know more about dinosaurs today than we did 50 years ago. We know more about the layout of ancient Egypt than we did 100 years ago. So there's a sense where more of the information of the past exists in the future than it did in the past. We're advancing into more patterning of the past,
right?
Which is very peculiar, right? It's easier for me to listen to the music of the 60s than it was for people in the 60s to listen to the music of the 20s. So there's an interesting, right? Not necessarily at the level of physics, that would be pretty speculative, but experientially and culturally, there's something like this spiraling together of the future and the past that's going on culturally and technologically at the moment.
Right, that's leading people to talk about things like changes in the present actually are changing the past. And again, you don't have to think about it as actually retrocausation, but the way that the past is constellating itself for us as a gestalt that affects our experience, that's being transformed.
One of the most stimulating ideas about time I ever came across was Terence Mckenna's fractal time wave theory. I don't know if you're that familiar with it, but his idea was that there was something like a temporal black hole whose gravitation was pulling us toward it, and the acceleration toward this temporal attractor is what we think of as history emerging out of the biosphere, and that it has a particular fractal signature that is self-similar at all scales, so that the whole wave has a certain look, and each epoch has the same look, and each chapter of your life and each day and each moment, such that you could say, I woke up this morning, it was the beginning of time, and around 4 o'clock it was the 1700s, that kind of thing. There was a qualitative self-similarity at all the scales of time.
Right.
No real way to check on that, but what a fantastically mind-opening notion.
It really is. And yeah, that could get to some of the framings from TSK that I might bring in. But I wanted to know where you wanted to go first with the historical narrative.
Well, it's interesting because we're at this place where we introduced all the trans deep time complexity and remixing. Do we want to step past that? Seems like on the one hand, yes, you want to give pride of place. I certainly want to indulge in the form of time that is closest to my heart and my hope. Trans pluralistic trans eternity enfolded into itself, something like that. But at the same time, it's also the most dangerous one to talk about. It's the one you're going to get wrong the most. It's the one that has the least evidence to back it up. And it might be better for it to just sit there as the unexplained next that goes beyond and brings together the green time. I don't know. How do you feel?
With Derrida, we can say we can leave it hovering there messianically.
I think that's a good description of it to some degree. You know, I had all these experiences and thoughts about time as a kid. One of my first ones was I used to try to imagine a brick wall at the beginning or the end of time and couldn't do it. It was very vexing to me. It took me a long time to get really clear on the fact that there were two different infinities. Right? There's a temporal infinity that's imaginable, I think, right? You can imagine a process and you can think that it doesn't end. Okay, great. You can't imagine a currently infinite amount of something, right? It's something that's so great that you couldn't imagine adding anything to it. You can't grab infinite space in a moment, but you can have an infinite process. That was really interesting, and it came to me as a kid as a result of trying to think whether I could think time starting or ending. And then I had these, you know, young adult experiences of being in a trans-temporal hyperspace. And then I became critical of that interpretation. And where I am now is there's an impression that suggests itself to me very readily about time. And the impression is of the present moment being the only thing that exists because there's no other spaces for a past or future to live in. But the present moment operating simultaneously at multiple scales. You know, a lifetime might count as a type of present moment. A mood for a while might count as a present moment. Not just an instant counts as a present moment. So this nested scale of present moments in which everything is churning over, but none of the time is quite identical to itself, right? My ideas of the metaphysics of adjacency come into play, where, you know, the spatial next to and the next moment in time are operative because they are part of the definition of anything. A moment is always sort of itself and the next moment. Mm-hmm. It can never just be itself apart from the next moment. And we all kind of know that because, you know, like the present moment is already gone by the time you notice it's the present moment, right? It always already slips past itself. And so I have this sense that there's a half a next moment built into the constantly folding nested present moments. And it's everywhere just a split second in front of you. It's just the coming together of the present moment. And I have this image of this gigantic divine hummingbird that's right there. It's facing me all the time. And it's a hummingbird to me because it hovers, because it's incandescent, and because it has this beautiful droning quality, right? It has the universal ohm. It hums somehow. And it's the front apex of time's constant sharing of its patterns with itself at all scales in the present moment. It's the convergent, divergent place where all the information momenta of the now meet each other, get organized, and feed back into each other to stay organized as a reality. So overall, that's how I see time at the moment.
You know what? I love that because I have almost a parallel to that, where for me, time is this lemniscape, you know, the infinite. And instead of a hummingbird, I see a golden bee with a turquoise head.
Ah, beautiful.
I've entertained that image for a long time, of this golden bee with the turquoise head. And the lemniscape is like in the wings of that, where the past and the future are both folding torus-like into the present. And that we shouldn't think that center of the lemniscape is where time really is. It's in the whole thing.
Yeah, that the figure 8 is the present moment.
Right.
And I know, like Mckenna used to talk about the transcendental object at the end of time. And I like that, except there isn't an end of time. It's right there at the edge of the present. It doesn't change. It's kind of also the Vajra, you know, it's the wish-granting, flashing jewel. But I find it interesting we both experience it as something organic, as creature-like in a certain sense.
Yeah, there's a practice I got from the bone tradition where that image first emerged for me, where you imagine the turquoise-headed bee feeding at the flowers of all your sense organs. And that is this, dynamic calling forth or coalescing of experience through each of the sense doors that you can experience. That comes from the Mother Tantra. But yeah, if we look at time hovering there in that sense, right? One word that I like to use sometimes is the future infinitive. That there's this sense of time, of the future that never arrives. And it's the never arriving of the future that potentiates everything. If it arrived, it'd be finished, right? It's non-arriving. It's messianic hovering that is the potentiating of this becoming. And so there's something black hole like that also, in a sense, but it's not the past as it's entangled with the past, but it's not the past, as Mckenna was saying.
I think we're very visually, we're very familiar with the idea of a vanishing point, which vanishes spatially but doesn't ever get vanished.
Right.
Or a horizon that's always there no matter how close you get to it. And there's something like a temporal vanishing point or temporal horizon.
Right.
And I think that's, for me, questions like, is there novelty or do we live in a deterministic universe, are typically not very meaningful questions. I feel like they're kind of superficial. Right? It's very easy for me to imagine a physically deterministic universe in which there is a constant novel quality that is unpredictable in all contexts, but is nonetheless fixed and plays perfectly well with determinism. Mm-hmm. Right? And that quality of novelty that's always going to surprise any pattern context is there at that vanishing point of time. It doesn't have to actually vanish. It doesn't have to be a rupture from regular time in order to play that role, any more than the horizon has to be something other than the world you're traveling on to be perpetually leading you forward as if it were something new. Right.
There's almost like, contextually emergent about it. It's entangled with the whole thing. TSK would say it's entangled with the whole readout. TSK talks about moments as readouts that have nothing to do with any other readout. They're complete in themselves. One thing I wanted to touch on, maybe connecting what you were doing as the historical overview with maybe something that we can look at in our own experience in terms of how we relate to time individually. And so one, you could say there's a kind of a zero-dimensional time in which it's non-reflective. And it's not only primitive beings that are inhabiting that, but sometimes we just are doing stuff without any sense of time. We're just immersed in habit and routine and carrying something out, and there's no sense of temporal horizons or anything there. We're just kind of unconsciously doing our activity. And then there's one-dimensional time where it feels linear, and time is then experienced as something that has a directionality, and often we have a somewhat oppositional relationship to it. Time is something that bears down on us or presses us towards something, or there's a sense of a linear progress, and then there's all the anxiety that can go with that if we're not, if we're feeling the gap between where we are and where we need to be. And that's usually related to like single loop learning where we're able to, we have enough temporal scope of vision that we can see what we're doing, and we can see what the outcome is, and we can notice the gap between what we did and what's the outcome, and then we learn how to adjust and try to do it again and hopefully succeed. But we're not able to yet take a perspective on our process. We just see the outcome in this linear temporal direction, and we adjust if it's not working, right? So there's that sense of relating to time as this temporal flow that's pushing us in a particular direction. Then you can say there's like a two-dimensional way of looking at time where we have that sense of the linear flow, that we know moments follow moments, that there are sequences of events that unfold. We can make cause-effect predictions and that sort of thing. But now we also have an expanded sense of presence. It's like almost an intersecting line, making the two dimensions, where we can feel also that there's a containing field of presence or awareness or something that's not moving. That is the context in which that movement is happening. So we're able to have more presence to the activity, and that allows us to have double loop learning, in which we're able to actually not only see our activity, but see some of the processes that we're engaged in that are creating our patterns. And then we can adjust those processes if we need, rather than just, so yeah, it's basically the next level of abstraction, or being able to take ourselves as object. And that's often, it's not always, but that's kind of often as far as a lot of popular spiritual literature goes. And some people have even criticized Wilber that that's about as far as he goes in terms of some of his presentation, and that it's the intersection of the nunc stans and the nunc fluens. But he doesn't talk about necessarily anything that really gets at the diaphanity and transparency and the interpenetration that Gebser talks about. I think there may be some poetic moments where Wilber does, but anyway, I don't want to get lost in the weeds on whether he does or not. It's not meant as a criticism of Wilber, but it is very popular that that's often where people seem to stop.
It's difficult to go any further.
Yeah.
It takes time. It takes some variety of philosophical temperament, a free time and a desire to do it. I have some of that myself. I have a tendency towards analytic non-dualism, I might call it, where it's not enough for me to simultaneously affirm two valid perspectives or opposites. I need to, because I've experienced them as utterly non-contradictory, I need to be able to analytically articulate the structure in which they are simultaneously defined as the same thing.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think that would be, if you wanted to go there, in this limited way of explaining it, that would be adding a third dimension, where you've got where now time is a kind of fullness that allows for all possibilities that can erupt into into the plane, right? And so there's the possibility for novel eruption there that doesn't seem to be quite there in the other modeling. And there's this deep sense of them being the same thing, being so deeply interpenetrated with each other.
Yeah,
Um,
it's one thing. It's already very impressive and very true to our best moments of perception to say being and becoming, time and eternity are simultaneous and mutually true.
yeah,
But there's a further step you can go if you want your mind to more resemble your experiences, and you've had these experiences where you want to say, here's how time is the definition of the timeless and vice versa.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think the green time, what we have is 3 dimensions of space and 1 dimension of time, right? And that's often the double loop learning, the triple loop learning, and that's where you really begin to embody time in a new way. But that's insisting that time gets multiple dimensions as well, right? Not just confined to 1 dimension of the largely spatially privileged thing.
Yeah, or subsumed as just a 4th dimension of space. Now,
Right.
Einstein got a lot of amazing insights out of that structure, so we don't want to critique it too much, but I have a sense, I'm not totally on board with Lee Smolin, but there's a sense of a movement in the physics community to reassert the primacy and the reality of time, and to make the insistence that it's qualitatively and behaviorally different than just another dimension of space. That space-time is a little too hasty. It's not quite one thing, even though they're definitely interlocked.
Right. Yeah, so one thing that I was thinking about, and I don't know if it really will go anywhere in terms of conversation, but often when we relate to time, if we're thinking about, what's the value of this kind of conversation we're having, and I'm hoping that part of the value is we can emphasize for us and possibly for others, what impact it can have in terms of, shifting your experience and your relationship to time, in terms of your own self-construction, in terms of your own experience. And one thing I was thinking about is often when we relate to time conventionally, we relate to it as an it, right? If we want to bring in integral language, we don't do a 3-2 or, the 3 faces of spirit with time, right? We don't really, we relate to it only as an it, as a force that either indexes, either it's an abstract thing that's an index, or it's a force that bears on us in that linear thing, or it's maybe an ocean in which we're immersed. But in all cases, they're a little bit subtler levels, but it's all treated as an object. Still, it's in the it. So what happens if you relate to time as thou, as I?
I feel like I basically never hear anyone use a second person relationship. Now, perhaps it was more common, Chronos and Kairos, and, the etymology of Kali might be something like black time, right? So there may have been visual archetypal embodiments of certain kinds of time that were addressed in the religion of the ancient world. But generally, I never hear that. I do hear a little bit of the first person, because there is a connection between time and subjectivity in some models, right? Forrest Landry's metaphysics actually makes this really apparent, where space is something like the third person, where you behold it. You see all of the parts of a picture all together as if in a frozen moment, so you can objectively analyze them. But your actual lived experience is immediate. It's only in this moment and this moment and this moment that your subjectivity, insofar as you can be said to have it, is your constant, complete immersion in the temporal process.
So what do you think of the value of relating to time as thou, if there is any?
Well, it's something I don't think people have tried very much for at least several thousand years, but it's definitely worth the experiment, I think. When we get to the future of religion talks, I'll try to bring in some of my ideas about what's an appropriate functional relationship to the various powers and things, right? But definitely time as an entity, a power, one of the psychophysical functions that we need in order to have a reality. In that sense, it is a God. It is one of the powers. And in order to have a good relationship with the powers so that you and your civilization can thrive, you have to enter into some kind of dynamic interaction, which for humans almost inevitably involves conceiving it as the other, because that's how we know how to have relations. So I think definitely people should be talking to and sacrificing things to and worshiping time. Just to be safe. Like that, let's talk about the utility of time, how people experience it, how they can change that experience, and what good that might be. I think it's pretty obvious to most of us, if we think about it, that if we took time more seriously, we would have a more mature life. And if our society took time seriously, we'd have a better planet, right? Our culture needs to behave as if it takes the next 10 years, the next 100 years, the next 1,000 years, as if they're really going to happen. Right? We can't handle the planet, we can't handle technology, we can't handle ecology unless we viscerally experience those time scales as if they're really going to happen. Likewise, myself, a person in a life, there's a moment where you think, oh, maybe I'll eat that. And you're thinking of the first second when you eat it. But what will it be like when you've eaten it? And what will it be like in an hour? And you feel like your energy and your thinking is clouded, right? Your odds of making love successfully have gone down because you had that second bowl of chili. Like, of course it did, just like last time. Or you can't go for that jog, or you're unable to formulate things clearly, or whatever it is. Just a little bit off, but it's because you didn't take an hour from now as seriously as you took a minute from now. And why is that? And it works backwards as well. When Corey DeVos and Keith Witt had their recent talk on time, one of the things I really liked that Keith brought up was we need to be able to take the past seriously. Right? That's an important thing therapeutically in order to work through things, in order to come into the present. You have to be able to take the past seriously, and also so that you stop getting it mixed up for your present experience, right? Trauma is some of the past that you haven't been able to digest, and you keep getting it mixed up with your present. You haven't been able to be serious enough with it somehow in your own being to handle it for whatever reason. And we're all like that. There's things about the past we need to take more seriously, and there's ranges, there's scales of future time we need to be able to take more seriously, just so we have a better, more coordinated life, and also so that collectively we don't destroy everything by acting on too short a time scale, which is encouraged by the processes of the current economy. Right? We put things in light bulbs so they burn out, so you have to buy a new one. We're on a quick turnover rate. But in reality, to manage things, we're going to have to be on a long scale somehow.
Yeah, great points. And that really stood out to me in Corey's conversation as well in that video. I really enjoyed their conversation. And I was thinking about that presence of the past in us in terms of trauma. David Bohm has a distinction between thinking and thoughts, and feeling and felts. And thoughts are, basically old patterns of ideas that repeat themselves, and felts are constellations of feeling and mood that can be resurfaced, when there are the right triggers in the environment. Those old felts come up, and we think that we're actually actively feeling that, but actually it's just a replay, in a sense, of that constellation of feelings that is still there as an undigested, imprint of experience. And so, yeah, there's this, I think, a deep need to learn to metabolize those things, to work through those things, and to fold that time into us as nutrients, ultimately. And it's interesting also that, some of the earlier cultures, or the tribal cultures, they had habits of thinking of out to the seventh generation. They had learned from maybe, the precariousness of their balance, that they had to hold a bigger temporal window. Now it seems like maybe we have a big enough of a support and a cushion that we can indulge in only thinking about the next day or the next moment or the next fiscal year. And we don't, even though scientifically we have the ability to hold this massive time scale, the supports that we have, that maybe we feel enough security around us, enough lack of vulnerability that we can indulge in living out much shorter time windows. And I think that's to our detriment.
I think the industrial method of specialized roles, of outsourcing a lot of your tasks to experts and specialists, is incredibly, it's a beautiful, efficient concept that's given the world so much. But it does break us off of some of the ancient ways of anticipating the reality of time, right? If I'm running a primitive farm, I have to take the next cycle, the next season. I have to take that very seriously. I live as if that's the reality. But when I can expect that the city, like here where I live, if the city workers don't come out at 4 a.m. to clear the roads when the snow comes, that's it. We're all shut down. But they do. I don't have to anticipate that. There's a specialized cadre of functionaries doing each thing so that I'm free to act as if I'm in a short time window.
Exactly. Yeah, so you don't want to traumatize people, with exaggerated tales of climate change and that sort of thing. I think there's some recklessness around that. I think there is urgency in terms of how we should respond to the deleterious effects that we're having on the planet in terms of pollution and other negative impacts. But how do we balance that where we can help people take seriously enough the predicament we're in and help them to begin to hold the scope of time necessary that we realize that we're going to hurt ourselves if we keep living within these impoverished time windows.
Well, part of it is just a framing and an orientation, for sure. One of the underappreciated pieces of Jordan Peterson's work is a hypothesis he puts forward in Maps of Meaning, that the experience of meaning is proportional to the action you're taking in the direction of your values on multiple timescales. So that, yes, there's something satisfying to you right now. If it's also satisfying to you tomorrow and a year from now and 10 years from now, the more of those scales that you do in fact live in, that you're simultaneously addressing with the same action, the more you get this sense of feedback, which is the experience of meaning. So that's a very interesting, right? So just the sense that we remember that we have a pragmatic and ethical obligation to ourselves even, let alone our loved ones in the world, at multiple timescales, that we really are living in multiple timescales. There's strategies that are brilliant strategies if you don't plan to live another 5 years. But most of us, turns out we do live that 5 years, and so we should have been using the 5 more years strategy. So there's that. There's a kind of framing that has the ability to ethically orient us a little bit. But I think there's also cognitive exercises that could enrich and strengthen our ability to compute time. Like this thing I mentioned before, like L. Ron Hubbard, he's not totally a narcissistic pathological liar and con man. He also has some very interesting philosophical ideas. And one of them is this notion, it's based on his idea that you're basically generating reality. And so that if you don't have enough time, if you're running out of time, you feel harried, you feel rushed, you're not getting things done, you don't have the temporal spaciousness to get everything organized, it's because you're not generating enough time. And you're not generating it because you're not attending to it, which is a creative activity. And so he would say things like, you watch a second hand go by. How long does it take? How long does a moment take? You're going to move your hand, just watch it. Try to feel how long it takes, right? So you're doing this activity of repeatedly watching and feeling into durations. Now, if you take his metaphysics out of it, you still have something like the brain's time organizing circuitry can be exercised by intentional, repeated attention to durations. You're energizing those circuits. And therefore, your ability going forward to organize your own time will presumably get better in a more or less spontaneous fashion. So that's an interesting approach.
That is, yeah, that's really close to some exercises in TSK, working with time and with moments in a similar way. One of which is it's an exercise called moments within moments, and you practice looking at or watching what happens within a given length of time, and you go back and you keep doing that. And as you keep exercising that, and as you keep kind of deepening into your contact with a particular set duration, you discover over time that you can actually hold more and more within that same limited, concretely set clock time moment, that it's not fixed in terms of the amount of experience that it can hold. We already know that, in terms of, when we have an accident or something like that, where we enter a flow state, and suddenly you're able to actually calculate and perceive and do many more things within split seconds than normally we do, that we just pass through unconsciously. So we know in those moments that it's possible to have an expanded capacity for experiencing and taking note and making discernments within it.
We've done some interesting experiments where you have people try to respond as quickly as they can to digital prompts, and then you also have them do it while they're bungee jumping, so that in those high stress things, different parts of the brain kick on, and it turns out they actually can process things faster than they normally can. A different gear kicks in.
Right. Right. So that's something that's plastic. We take a moment as a fixed thing, and it doesn't have to be. So, if the more that you can realize that there's a lot more that can be done in this time, the less that you can feel stressed by, by the relative limited amount of clock moments or whatever that you have.
I'm very lazy in a way. So I'm always looking for developmental exercises that don't get in the way of me just doing anything else. And
right.
One of them is just guessing and checking on time, right? That while you're doing anything, you could estimate the amount of time you think it's going to take and then just check. Mm-hmm. For some people, that can be very disruptive, right? They don't want to have to think about scheduling. It seems very stressful to them. But I think it is a skill that you can get better at. You think, well, I'm going to go out and get the mail, and I think it'll take me 1 minute and 47 seconds. I don't know where I got that number. I'm just going to go with it. And then it turns out I was under by 20 or over by 30 or whatever it is. But if I wanted to get better at throwing darts, I would have to pick a target and throw and see if I was too far to the left or too far to the right, and then try to correct for that. So unless you make a target, you're not going to be able to improve your accuracy on a skill. So you have to make a target, and in this case, that's just a guesstimate about the duration it will take for you to accomplish a particular task.
Right. And
it doesn't really you're just doing the same task. It's not like you're going out of your way to do anything different. You're just throwing this little extra checking in there, which I hope is enriching my capacity to cognitively map and therefore work with and therefore move in synchronous tempo with time processes.
Right. There's for some, I would say it might be counterintuitive, but TSK associates the notion of time with intimacy. And a deepened sense of time is actually a deepened sense or experience of intimacy with what's present, right? And so I think if you begin to explain it like that, it makes sense. So even that exercise that you're describing of setting limits and then, testing yourself against this clock time and how efficiently you do that. At the same time, if people are, there are some feeling type people possibly who might not want to just like have that kind of interruption but if you can also realize that that kind of exercise actually is increasing your capacity to be intimate with every moment. Yeah. It's not only increasing efficiency, it's also increasing participation. it's also increasing your ability to be deeply related to what is bubbling up.
There's another exercise that I've come across a few times that was used in the Gurdjieff tradition. I don't know if it still is, but it would be exercises that are scheduled. So you would say you're going to remember yourself, perhaps in the sense of consciously accessing the whole body inner sensation of your being. You're going to do that for 1 minute at 2:19 tomorrow, no matter where you are or what you're doing. And if you miss it, you're going to have to put your hand in a bucket of ice water for 5 minutes, just so you remember, right? So instead of practicing your inner exercise, just whenever you have time, you set a moment in the future where it's going to happen. And then you organize yourself through time, but also you're setting yourself up to be more present, more intimate with time at that moment.
Right, and I think that's, people in religious traditions, what we've inherited from the calendar traditions, where they have sacred time set out throughout the year. I mean, I think we can relate to it from that angle that you're looking at there. I like the metaphor that they sometimes say that in the Jewish tradition, the Sabbath is a temple carved in time, and that they don't have the physical temple to go to, but instead they've learned to carve a temple in time. And that temple is a place where you become more intimate with being, right? You stop the things that you normally do that keep you propelling along the linear habitual path, and you settle into a different time modality. It opens up different possibilities for connection, intimacy, flowering.
There's a certain ambiguity about speeding up or slowing down, right? About seeming time transcendence through high performance and seeming time transcendence through release, or through, right? If you were tracking faster, you might out-track your normal experience of time. You might see, beyond your brain's normal clock rates.
Right.
At the same time, if you slow way down, you might get that experience. And so there is, there's the high performance athlete or the emergency situation where everything seems to slow down. But there's also these kinds of relaxations. One of the things that's very common in trance induction is to sort of dysregulate people's conventional experience of time. And presumably you're rolling them back to the quality of a more primitive experience of time in which they can reprogram themselves and experience some regenerative enchantment. But the whole counting down from 10 to 1, you're introducing a time sequence, but you actually interfere with it a little bit, right? Once they're going on 10 and 9 and 8, then you pause a little too long before you give them the 7. You throw those you're going deeper now, right? You throw these things and you're disrupting the sequence. And you might say, maybe you're going to go into this trance right away, or maybe it's going to take 5 minutes, or maybe it's going to take a half an hour. And later when you come out of it, I don't know if you're going to feel the effects right away, or in 3 days, or 6 days, or 9 days, or 112 days. You set up these little sequences and then you disrupt them. So the brain constantly goes, oh, my sequencing didn't work. My sequencing didn't work. And you end up in a more primitive, relaxed time, which is oddly like the experience of tracking time really well. So they do seem to come together at some point on the circle.
I was going to say that, and I feel that. Sometimes I've been in the emergency situation where everything has slowed down, but actually there was a sense that I was actually tracking things much better. I can think also of an experience I had in India where I had been following and watching the flow of my thought while I was out taking a walk along the river. And eventually I settled down on this rock at the sunset and was just meditating there and quiet. And I'd entered a place of real stillness. And then when I emerged from that, everything was actually very dynamic and active. And I felt my whole body was like effervescence of Buddhist term I think is kalapas, the little moments of atoms of experience just bubbling. And I could just feel that bubbling throughout my whole being of just like time popping, popping, popping. And in one sense, there was a speeded up quality to that. But in another sense, there was the sense of things having slowed down, that you could just see all of these little activities happening that normally are obscured by the haze of our, of our normal modes.
These are all very personal and experiential ways of enriching our time. That may also lead to our more sophisticated coordination and organization of our activity going forward. But there's also some interesting cultural and even economic problems with a lack of time mindfulness, let's say. One of the things I see a lot is products and processes being miscalculated because the sample size duration was incorrect. And there's a very famous example of this, which is the Pepsi challenge. So if people remember, in the 80s, they blindfolded a bunch of people who thought they liked Coca-Cola and gave them sips. Most of them preferred Pepsi, right? And Coke freaked out. It was an incredible advertising campaign. Coke actually canceled Coca-Cola and created the new Coke, which was structurally more similar to Pepsi. It had more sugar and more salt, which was what Pepsi had. Nobody liked it. And so they had to cancel that and go back to the original one, which was now called Coke Classic. Why was it that nobody liked the new Coke if it had the same stuff that they liked in the Pepsi? Well, it turns out that if you take one sip of something, you really prefer the thing that has more sweetness on average. If you have to drink a can of it, partway through that can, you're sick of the salt, you're sick of the syrup, you want something lighter and more refreshing. So the duration of the sampling time led to directly opposite conclusions. And you could have the same thing, for example, if a corporation was creating a film, right? You're going to have a big action sequence. You put a whole bunch of money into a whole bunch of CGI robots flying in all directions, and people are sitting in the test theater and they're pressing the button to indicate how interested they are. And as it starts, they go, yeah, that's an action scene, all right. But you checked with them after 1 second. You didn't check with them necessarily at the end or in a day or in a week, because people come out of these things and go, yeah, I thought I kind of liked it, but on retrospect, it kind of sucked, I actually found myself bored by the action sequence after a little while, and in hindsight, I didn't like it, even though my first moment of experience was just recognition that it was happening. So if they take a 5-second sample size, it's very different than a 5-minute sample size or a 5-day sample size. You could get opposite results from the same phenomenon and end up producing cultural products that initially seems like everybody's going to love it, but the progressive consensus of people is, nah, I don't like that. That's happening with a lot of beloved franchise movies at the moment, and it may have to do with the sampling duration.
Yeah, so what can we do with big data now to be able to take and alter our time perspectives? I think we're going to be able to do that. In fact, I think people are doing that. They're tracking unexpected correlations globally across, seemingly unrelated events, and just seeing what information could be yielded from that. And there's the tracking information flows through social networks and what's spiking. I think we're being able, with technology is giving us the capacity to take bigger and bigger and more nuanced perspectives on the timing out of patterns in our culture. And I think it's really a rich and dangerous and complex and probably mysterious frontier. We don't know exactly where we're going to go with that or what it's going to make possible. What do you think? Do you have because I know you've had in thoughts, for instance, on massive internal profiling and that kind of thing. So obviously there's consideration for the big data. We have to think about the lower right.
The
In
thing
other
about
words.
big data is you have to know what to look for. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it isn't there. Right. So one of the things I've noticed that I've brought up in basically every part of this discussion is simultaneous multiple timescales. That's
Right.
been in every example I've come up with, I think. So you have to know to check for that in the data, right? You have to check for the data along multiple durations. One of the problems that online discussion sites often have is they privilege the recent, which is implicitly selecting for a particular time scale. And in that case, you get the people who talk the fastest or talk the most showing up the soonest. And people come in and they think, well, I guess that represents the kind of people in this group. I will either join or not join, probably not join because I don't like the people who talk the most and the fastest. Right? So there's a way that the privileging of that time scale in the software is giving a false impression, and it's giving you only one sample size. So there might be ways for the software to present a variety of sample sizes. There might be ways for industry, for anybody to present these different time scales simultaneously. And if you were going to build a massive internal profiling civilization, your devices for tracking the data would have to take multiple timescales into account. Right? If you were going to say we're going to switch off the kind of external policing and regulation and analysis, which we know doesn't work very well, external profiling, and go to a psychological, biometric, medical, neurological, spiritual, evolving, multiphasic, multidimensional, multi-intelligence profile of a person, you have to know as the analyst that they aren't fixed in one moment's profile. And you as a person, to participate in a system like that, you have to know you're not going to get pigeonholed in a slice of yourself, right? That if you say, hypothetical science fiction example, you can take anything you want on a plane, but anybody who has the neurochemical and psychological profile of a terrorist cannot get on the plane, no matter what they have in their bags. And they can say, well, that's not fair. And you can say, yes, but it's my plane company. I don't have to let you on. But come back when you have a different psychological profile, and I will happily let you on this plane. It has to be something like that, right? You're not going to permanently ostracize anybody just because they have a particular profiling configuration. That would be unethical and preposterous. But in order to get around that, you have to be thinking that there's multiple scales of analysis for anybody's psychological profile. A developmental model, in principle, is one with extended, open-ended frames of analysis.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that people feel just instinctively, at least in the West, somewhat terrified of what could be unfolding in China, is that it seems to be taking too narrow of a slice of data and of too narrow a temporal slice of the individual's lives and the amount of data that is being used to make life-changing decisions.
Yeah, you want to know, in part, one of the most important things is what's a person been doing in order to get into the position that they're in. That tells you an enormous amount about them. Where they're at right now, how they responded online this morning doesn't necessarily tell you a lot.
Right.
And that's also one of the problems of general online communication is the rapid response time. Nassim Taleb, for all of his flaws, has some really good arguments about how you can get more informed with fewer samples of things. That the person who watches the news every day ends up knowing less than the person who watches the news once a month. Because the person watching every day doesn't know how much of it is bullshit. They don't know what's going to get canceled out or contradicted tomorrow. And they get overloaded with a bunch of information that they can't filter. And when you sample it by the month, you end up knowing just the things that stick around, which are the things that got vetted during the month. So there's a way in which a less informed person could be more informed if they use a different time frame.
We have some people training themselves in that, looking at the stock market, for instance, and how do we translate that out into other domains, to really take these multiple time scales at once. I think there's a possibility that video games and virtual reality can be used to train us to shift temporal frames if we use those things intelligently.
Well, I'd like to add that there's a classical means of time training that passed around under the virtue of patience. So on the one hand, we talked about meta-opportunistic kairos, and there is a lot of, this is your moment, this is your chance, this is your moment in the sense that you could take advantage of something. This is also your moment in the sense that you are multi-dimensionally attuned, reciprocally attuned to all the patterns that are arising as you go forward. There's that stuff about your moment, but where the hell was I going with that? I forget what we were just talking about. I got carried away. I tried to imagine Kairos and address it in the second person while I was talking.
Oh, okay.
And then I just had nothing. Time steals all things.
That's right. Yeah, I was going to say, you were mentioning Mahakali, right? And there's Kali has two different meanings. Kali is black, but Kal, K-A-L or K-A-L-A is time, right? So in Buddhist tradition, Mahakal is great time. That's what also TSK uses for the biggest, most expansive view on time. And Mahakali is the great black goddess. It's death, so there's the holding of Mahakal as the great time, Mahakali as death together. And it looks like Mahakali just had her lunch with...
Yeah, absolutely. I tend to fuse them and think in terms of black time as sort of a single translation.
Right.
But there's definitely a similarity there when you think of Kairos and Kronos and Saturn and kind of the Reaper as well.
Right.
And the devourer of his children.
Yeah.
There's a Gurdjieffian phrase, which is the merciless Heropas, which is what his word for time is. And in Beelzebub's Tales, there's a notion of God originally created the universe. Everything was perfect, but it existed all at once. And time began, and it moved forward, and everything fell apart. Even the world at the center of reality where God manifests started to decay just because time was passing. So God had to recreate the universe to counteract time, and he had to create this universe of reciprocally co-constructive processes in order to defeat the fact that just the passage of time was going to wreck even a perfect kingdom.
Basically what the universe figured out to do about entropy.
Yeah, you got to find some way to make the process go the other way by absorbing the entropy.
Exactly.
I think one of the things I was going to say before Kali ate my mind was about the tempo we get into in social media, right? The Twitter speed, the Facebook speed, the tendency of people to make a quick grab of the first sentence of your article to see if they want to read it and what they associate with it positively or negatively, and then move on. That idea of the quick grab, which is a skill and it's very legitimate, but it's come to predominate through the technological and software that we have. And it's keying up a certain form of our neurological time circuitry, which puts us in a position where it's difficult to access the deep time of ease or the intensified time of high performance, the social time of experience, the natural time of experience, and the longer ranges of time for maturation and for being custodians of the world. I know there's counter movements, right? There's the long now, the big clock people. There's people trying to produce objects and thought processes, artifacts, literature that's going to try to lead us to longer time frames. But they've got their work cut out for us if absolutely everybody is accessing the rapid time scale multiple times every day and in being incentivized to do it.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. I was just thinking about that. How can we, whether it's through technology or other means, build in ways naturally to telescope through different time modalities and modes of relating to things, because otherwise we really will become, I think, too narrowly driven into a very, linear and compelled form of temporal processing that actually is a source of suffering for people.
One of the things I find that I do, if I have the time, is to wait until an organic duration, a felt shift has occurred. Felt shift is Gendlin's famous phrase, but let's say you go to the park and you sit down on a bench. Here I am. I got out of the house. I'm going to experience nature. How long should I sit here? Now, maybe you have to get back to the office in 20 minutes, but if you don't, you can try sitting there until you feel it's been long enough, until something instinctive shifts. And very often in my experience, there's a thwart right before that. You start feeling like, well, that's long enough. I've been here long enough. You've come up against the edge of the current mode, even just chemically that you're in. And if you stay a little bit longer than that, you get, oh, now I'm really here in the park.
Yeah.
But that shift when one mode gave way to the next mode, those are longer and organically instantiated clocks that we kind of embody rather than think about.
Right. Yeah, you're saying that reminded me of something I was going to bring up earlier. I think it reminded me because I often in my classes ask some students to go out to a park or something like that to do this exercise. I got it from the book, The Spell of the Sensuous, but it's for helping us to inhabit time differently. And the exercise basically is to, put yourself in a park, put yourself in some setting that you have a moment to be, and to let yourself visualize all of the past and all of the future as balloons or as aspects of an hourglass on either side of you, and you're at the center, and let them pour into you and into the center. So fill yourself up with the sands of the past, and fill yourself up with the sands of the future, and feel what happens to your own presence as you let past and future empty into you, and see how that expands your perception and your ability to stay present with and be intimate with whatever setting you're in.
We were talking earlier about exercises like guessing a duration or, planning moments. Those are very good, and they help you comport yourself better with time and schedules and feel like you have more time and can get things done more fluidly. But there's a very prefrontal kind of sense to them. There's something else about a deeper instinctive clock that we might be able to take advantage of that our ancestors did, because we can assume they didn't necessarily have the same front of the brain high precision time processing that we have in response to our high precision time processing devices. But nonetheless, they could build a pyramid to last 1,000 years. They had this ability to harness some kind of rhythm that led to long custodianship of being. And presumably it wasn't based so much on consciousness, on what they'd learned, on the artifacts around them. It may have taken advantage of inbuilt instinctive intelligence that can change how we are positioned relative to time, how we embody time. But in order to do that, we'd have to exercise our instinctive ability to handle time, apart from our knowledge and our consciousness of the passage of time. And that bench sitting exercise is one, but there could be many other things where you try to wait for something else in you to make the time estimate of when to do something, how long to do something. Christopher Hyatt, who I knew a little bit, used to run New Falcon Press years ago. He wrote a book, and he recommended this exercise where if you have nothing else to do, just lay on the floor. Just lay on the floor all day until you're spontaneously moved to do something. Otherwise, don't let yourself get up and handle anything. It's a bit of a radical exercise, but it goes a little way to suggesting the effort that it takes to privilege a subconscious time processing impulse, a subconscious clock, something that tells you that's enough or now in a way that you don't fully understand. And it may be that kind of intelligence that we need in order to really deal with the future and the problems of the future.
Yeah, I think also of mindfulness traditions and some of the practices where you practice just slowing things down, eating very, very slowly or walking very, very slowly. And while there's something intentional and almost limit setting about that, I found in my experience that it actually opens you up to deeper instinctual movements because you can now witness them arising, where before they kind of like happen unconsciously and then you're just doing something. Here, when you've really slowed down, you can begin to get in touch with kind of the deeper organizing processes that are always there, and feel into the rhythms that are there, or the ear rhythms that are there. I really found sometimes that I could tune into places of disharmony or disjunction in myself in terms of how I was holding and relating to different aspects of my being, and maybe their temporal disjunction became clearer in that kind of practice.
Yeah, that's very similar in some ways to what I said earlier about anybody who wanted to pretend to do Tai Chi is going to automatically slow down their movements, right? And if you were going to pretend to do pranayama, you would slow down your breathing. If you were going to pretend to be mindful, you would try to slow down your cognition. So it's we're going to get in that process, you have the opportunity to map the texture of your moment of experience more thoroughly. And it may be that gives you more data with which to reciprocally attune your own timing at an unconscious level.
Right.
One thing I wanted to bring up, I mentioned Nietzsche earlier on, and I'd be remiss not to touch on the eternal recurrence in terms of Nietzsche and time, because he was such an advocate of time and change and becoming, and yet he had this notion of the endless repetition of the same. And it wasn't really a physics notion. The Greeks had talked about models like that. For him, it was a psychological test. It comes out of Thus Spake Zarathustra, where who has the capacity, if you could really feel the way you felt at every moment of your life over again, could you say, yes, I want this exact life, all those exact feelings with those intensities again and again forever with no change? That's the test, because some people could say yes in reality and some people could say no in reality. For some people, if they actually knew and remembered what all that was like, it would just destroy them to think they had to do it again. And for other people, they would have the affirmative capacity to say yes to it. And this would drive a wedge in the population, which he was always thinking about doing. But I recently, around New Year's, had my first ayahuasca experience. And in the experience, they, whatever they are, suggested something to me about the eternal recurrence in connection with shamanism. And what they said was, nobody knows what eternity means, so that's not what it's about. Eternity just means indefinite extension as far as you're concerned. And so this will to affirm the eternal recurrence is your willingness toward indefinite extension. And they said this was the secret of the ancient shamans, that this was the way in which the first experiences of demonstrated consecration occurred, right? The shaman passes you the pipe, but he does it as if he is immortal and this is occurring in eternity. He wills it to be indefinitely extended. And you have a certain kind of spiritual self-confidence when you will yourself or anything to be indefinitely extended. You change your bearing and you perform differently and you imbue everything you do with the overflowing, right, the mentally incommensurable category of unlimited extension. And there's an interesting parallel there with self-developmental exercises. I'm doing this Wim Hof stuff, but anybody who's done any exercise or has tried to get into cold showers knows that what you have to do is try it out. And while it's happening, you have to want it to go on, because tomorrow you want to do it a little longer, and then the day after a little longer, right? You want to do 10 more push-ups the next time. So you're experiencing this thing and you say, go on. I want this to go on. Even if I can't make it go on right now, I will it to extend an unknown amount through time. And that there's a parallel there between strength-building developmental exercise, the Nietzschean recurrence, and the shamanic as the ground zero of the human demonstration of what it's like to consecrate experience. This will to indefinite extension. So that's been playing on my heart for the last month, is this idea.
That's really beautiful. Thank you. And I think there's an echo of that really also in the Bodhisattva vow. There's the way it's framed almost, paradoxically, that, I vow to liberate all sentient beings and they're numberless, which basically suggests that you're never going to free all sentient beings. And therefore, do you still say yes to indefinite extension of your participation in the world? And I think there's a similarity there in terms of the ethical pull and the commitment of will to being present in and to being and beings.
That's a very interesting connection. Thank you. I'll think about that one. Seems like we've covered a lot of stuff. Is there anything outstanding in the time we have left?
I actually feel that we're at a good time for wrapping it up. And yeah, I will include at the end of our discussion a little exercise for people to try if they'd like to. I'll have a guided meditation for people to dip into time a little bit.
Terrific. I'm enthusiastic about people enriching their time mindfulness in any way that they can. And I think our mutual concerted contemplation of the topic is a good place to start. One thing I might add, one really interesting experience I had one time was of the displaced satisfaction of the reality of the past and the future. And what I mean is, this one evening, I wanted a sandwich, and it occurred to me that in the past, I had a sandwich. And for some reason that evening, that seemed so real, so true, the past, that I was satisfied in the present. And it seemed to me all that night that whatever I could think of that I wanted was something I'd already had or would have at some point, and therefore I was already satisfied. In time, I already had all my desires met, and therefore I was perfectly content to the point of giggling and overflowing all evening.
That's a really cool trick. I think you need to pass that on to Overeaters Anonymous.
Want to lose 10 pounds? Transcend time.
I really like the phrase time mindfulness.
Okay.
In terms of a catchy thing. So maybe let's use that.
Yeah. TM, time mindfulness, but also I trademark it right now.
Okay.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. I love this investigation. I always love doing a mutual contemplation with you.
Me too. Yeah, it's been delightful and really rich. So thank you. There are many ways to practice mindfulness of time, and we mentioned a few of them in our discussion. A simple place to begin is just making a practice of noting the temporal orientation of our ordinary thoughts, reflections, and reveries, whether during a formal sitting or in the midst of our daily activities. How often are we entertaining thoughts of the past or the future, mulling over memories or projecting future scenarios? These might be recollections or anticipations of temporally distant events, or of something just moments away. How often are we centered in present experience? As we deepen in these reflections, we can begin to notice also that each present moment of experience contains a past and a future to it, even if just in subtle traces. We can practice feeling into the past, present, and future of each moment. As we do so, we deepen our insight into the structure of so-called ordinary or habitual time, and may eventually begin to perceive how the self is situated in and even constructed out of such movements. These are simple practices you can do anywhere. For this closing meditation, I want to invite you to do an awareness exercise that doesn't explicitly call for thinking about time itself, but if you practice it regularly, it can lead you to a deeper order perception and experience of time or timing. Begin by finding a comfortable sitting position, one which helps you to be both relaxed and alert. Tune in more closely to the sound of the flowing water. And for this practice, we will use a special form of breathing. Place the tip of your tongue on the upper ridge of your mouth, a little behind your front teeth. Slightly open your mouth, and breathe in gently through both nose and mouth at the same time, in a relaxed and open way. You will notice that to do this well, you need to release facial and neck tension. Just let it go, and let the breath move gently in and out of your nose and mouth. As you breathe, rest your awareness in your throat center, mindful of the flow of breath through your throat center. Continue to pay attention to the sound of the flowing water and to the flow of breath through your throat center. Attending to these things does not need to be a separate mental act. Notice that the breath and the sound are already in awareness, already known. Let there be a wedding of sound, breath, and awareness easily in your throat center. Let it flow on.